Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 6 true disturbing stories from the most isolated reaches of Alaska. These are tales of people who ventured into the endless wilderness and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The cabin I inherited from my uncle sat about 40 miles west of Talkeetna, accessible only by float plane or a brutal 2-day hike that most people wouldn't attempt even in summer. Uncle Raymond had lived out there for 23 years before he died, and I'd only visited twice as a kid. I remembered it being beautiful in that overwhelming way Alaska has, where the silence isn't peaceful so much as it's just big enough to make you feel like you're trespassing on something ancient. I was 31 when I decided to spend a week out there in late September, mostly because my lawyer kept reminding me that property taxes were due, and I needed to decide whether to sell it or commit to keeping it. The float plane pilot who dropped me off was this grizzled guy named Howard who kept the conversation to grunts and nods, which suited me fine. As we descended toward the lake, I could see the cabin nestled against a wall of spruce trees, its green metal roof spotted with orange rust. The whole property couldn't have been more than an acre of cleared land before the forest took over completely. Howard helped me unload my gear onto the narrow dock, accepted his payment with a nod, and said he'd be back in 7 days unless I radioed earlier. The sound of the plane's engine faded gradually, and then I was standing there with 3 duffel bags and a cooler, watching ripples spread across the dark water. I'd forgotten how complete the quiet was out here. Not peaceful, exactly. More like the world was holding its breath. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, maybe 12 by 16 feet, with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder and a wood stove that looked like it had been there since the 70s. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, and it smelled like old wood smoke and something musty I couldn't quite place. There was a hand-pump sink that drew from a well, a propane camping stove, and shelves lined with rusted cans of food that were probably older than me. I spent the first hour just cleaning and airing the place out, trying to make it feel less like I was disturbing a tomb. That first night, I made coffee on the propane stove and sat on the porch as the sun set somewhere behind the mountains. The coffee tasted metallic, like the pot hadn't been properly cleaned in years, but I drank it anyway. I'd been planning to use this week to clear my head, maybe do some hiking, take photographs. I worked in IT back in Anchorage, and my life had started feeling like it was happening to someone else. I thought a week of silence might help me remember what I actually wanted. The thing I noticed on the second morning was subtle enough that I almost dismissed it. I'd left my hiking boots on the porch overnight, and when I went to put them on, they were positioned differently than I remembered. Toes pointing toward the door instead of away from it. I told myself I must have moved them without thinking, maybe when I was half awake stumbling to the outhouse in the middle of the night. But it bothered me in this low-level way I couldn't quite shake. That afternoon, I decided to explore the perimeter of the property. Uncle Raymond had cleared maybe 50 yards in a rough circle around the cabin, and beyond that the forest was dense enough that you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. I found the remains of what might have been a shed at one point, just rotted boards and rusty nails mostly reclaimed by moss. There was a fire pit with a circle of stones, and a path that led down to the lake shore. About 30 yards into the tree line, I found something that made me stop. It was a small cairn, maybe 2 feet high, made of smooth lake stones stacked in a careful spiral. Hanging from the top stone was a piece of bleached antler with symbols scratched into it. Not carved, scratched like someone had used a nail or a sharp rock. The symbols didn't look like anything I recognized. Not native Alaskan art, not runes, just these jagged, angular marks that hurt to look at somehow. I stood there for probably 5 minutes trying to decide what to make of it. Uncle Raymond had been a solitary guy, kind of eccentric, Maybe this was his version of yard art. But the antler was swaying slightly in the wind, and there was something about those scratches that made my mouth go dry. I took a photo with my phone and headed back to the cabin. That night, I was reading by lantern light when I heard footsteps on the porch. Not heavy footsteps, not the sound of boots. More like bare feet on wood, slow and deliberate. I froze with my book still open, listening. The footsteps moved from one end of the porch to the other, paused, then moved back. I could hear the boards creaking under weight. I called out, "Hello." My voice sounded thin and stupid. The footsteps stopped. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then forced myself to stand up and open the door. The porch was empty. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing, catching nothing but trees and darkness. But when I looked down at the porch boards, I saw them. Wet footprints, like someone had just stepped out of the lake. They started at the edge of the porch, walked its length, turned, walked back, and then simply stopped. No prints leading away. Just those wet marks that were already starting to dry in the cold air. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind in the trees sounded like whispers. The settling of the cabin's old boards sounded like something moving in the walls. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a voice call my name from outside. It was Uncle Raymond's voice, exactly as I remembered it from 20 years ago. Gruff and slightly amused, like he was about to tell me something funny. "Tommy," it called. "Come on out here, Tommy." I pressed my back against the wall of the sleeping loft and didn't move. The voice called my name 3 more times, each from a different direction. From the lake shore, from the tree line, from directly beneath the sleeping loft window. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the voice. When dawn finally came, I climbed down and made myself eat something even though my stomach was twisted with dread. I told myself I was being irrational, that isolation does things to your mind, that I was probably half dreaming. But when I opened the door to assess the morning, I found something that made all those rationalizations crumble. Arranged in a perfect circle around the cabin, maybe 10 feet from the walls, were dozens of those cairns. Small stacks of lake stones, each topped with a piece of bleached bone. Antler mostly, but some looked like they might be from smaller animals. Ribs, maybe. Each bone had those same jagged symbols scratched into them. I hadn't heard anyone building these. I hadn't heard anything except wind and that voice calling my name. I spent the next hour dismantling them, throwing the stones as far as I could into the woods, hurling the bones into the lake. It felt important to destroy them, like they were some kind of boundary I didn't want around me. My hands were shaking the whole time, and I kept glancing toward the trees expecting to see someone watching me. But the forest remained still and silent, like it was waiting for something. That afternoon, I tried to radio Howard, but all I got was static. I tried again every hour until the battery died, then replaced it with my spare and got the same dead air. The radio had worked fine when he tested it before flying off. I had 4 more days until he was scheduled to return, and suddenly 4 days felt like 4 months. The sun was setting when I saw it for the first time. I was bringing in firewood from the pile beside the cabin when movement caught my eye at the tree line. Something pale and thin was standing between 2 spruce trees, maybe 40 feet away. At first I thought it was a person, just someone standing very still. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the proportions were wrong. The arms hung too long, reaching almost to where its knees should be. The head was oval-shaped and smooth, tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop. I froze with an armload of firewood, unable to look away. It didn't move, just stood there backlit by the dying sun, watching me with whatever it used to watch. I couldn't see a face, just that smooth, pale surface where a face should be. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it took a step forward, and the way it moved was all wrong. The joints bent in directions that shouldn't be possible, like it was held together with loose string instead of tendons. One of the pieces of firewood slipped from my arms and clattered against the porch, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell was holding me. I stumbled backward through the cabin door, dropped the rest of the wood, and slammed the door shut. I pushed the heavy wooden table against the door and checked every window, making sure they were latched. The cabin only had 3 windows, all too small to climb through easily, and suddenly that felt like both a blessing and a trap. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, slow and measured, not trying to be quiet, the same deliberate pace as those bare feet on the porch the night before. Then the scratching started, on the walls, on the door, on the roof. Not frantic like an animal trying to get in, but methodical. Long, slow drags of something sharp against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through one of the windows, and for just a second I saw it pressed against the glass. That smooth, pale face, if you could call it a face, just inches from mine with only a thin pane separating us. No eyes, no mouth, just blank skin stretched over bone. I jerked away and the flashlight fell from my hands, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the dying embers in the wood stove. The scratching continued for hours. I sat in the corner farthest from the windows with my uncle's old hunting knife in my hand, listening to that sound and trying not to completely lose my mind. Sometime after midnight, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't move until I saw gray dawn light through the windows. My whole body ached from sitting tensed for so long. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. But every window had scratches in the glass, long parallel marks like something had dragged fingernails down them. And on the door, carved deep enough into the wood that I could stick my finger into the grooves, were those same jagged symbols from the bones. I spent that day preparing to leave on foot. I knew it was a 2-day hike back to anything resembling civilization, but I also knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed light, just water, some food, my sleeping bag, and the knife. The radio was useless. My phone had no signal, and waiting for Howard suddenly seemed like a death sentence. I left at noon, moving as fast as I dared on the overgrown trail. For the first few hours I thought I might make it. The forest was just forest, silent and indifferent, but as the sun started to sink I heard it behind me, footsteps matching my pace, staying just out of sight. When I walked faster, they walked faster. When I stopped, they stopped. I didn't look back. Some instinct deeper than thought told me that looking would be a mistake. I just kept moving, even as the light failed and the trail became harder to follow. My flashlight battery was dying, the beam growing dimmer and more yellow, and I knew I'd have to stop soon. You can't hike through dense Alaskan forest in complete darkness without breaking an ankle or walking off a cliff. I found a small clearing and made a cold camp. No fire because I didn't want to announce my position any more than I already had. I wedged myself between 2 large rocks with my back protected and the knife in my hand, and I waited for dawn. The footsteps circled my position all night, never getting closer but never leaving. Sometimes I heard my name whispered in Uncle Raymond's voice. Sometimes I heard breathing that sounded wet and labored, like something was wrong with its lungs. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and moved. I don't remember much of the second day, except the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. The footsteps followed me the whole way, and twice I saw that pale figure standing motionless between trees, watching me pass. But it never came close, not in daylight. I reached the ranger station just before dark, barely able to stand. The ranger on duty, a woman named Sarah Lindstrom, took one look at me and sat me down with hot coffee and a blanket. I told her I'd gotten turned around hiking and spent 2 nights in the woods. She nodded like that was perfectly reasonable and didn't ask about the scratches on my arms or why my eyes wouldn't stop darting toward the windows. I never went back. I had the lawyer sell the property sight unseen, and I didn't ask who bought it or what they planned to do with it. Sometimes I look at the photo I took of that first cairn, the one with the scratched antler, and I try to make sense of those symbols. But mostly I try not to think about what Uncle Raymond might have been keeping contained out there, or what those stone circles were actually meant to do, whether they were keeping something out or keeping something in. 3 weeks after I got back to Anchorage, I found a smooth lake stone on my apartment balcony. I'm on the 8th floor. There was a piece of bleached bone balanced on top of it, and scratched into the bone were those same jagged marks. I threw it away, but sometimes late at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow and deliberate, like bare feet on wood. They never stop at my door. Not yet. Story 2. I took the job as winter caretaker for the Denali Research Outpost mostly because I needed the money and didn't mind solitude. My name, S. Elena Blackwood, and at the time I was 28 and going through a divorce that had left me desperate for isolation. The outpost was a small cluster of buildings about 60 miles north of the main park entrance, accessible by snow machine or helicopter. It housed teams of biologists and climate scientists during the summer, but from October through March, it sat empty except for whoever was willing to spend 6 months making sure the pipes didn't freeze and the bears didn't break in. The pay was decent, the housing was free, and the job duties were minimal. Weekly equipment checks, daily weather reports radioed to park headquarters, and general maintenance. They warned me I'd be completely alone from November through February, and that I'd need to be comfortable with that. I told them I preferred it. Looking back, I should have asked why they were having trouble filling the position. The head researcher, a guy named Dr. Marcus Webb, gave me a tour in late September before the snow got too deep. He showed me the main lab building, the 2 dormitories, the equipment shed, and the generator building. Everything was functional and well-stocked. He walked me through the radio procedures, the emergency protocols, and the supply drop schedule. He was professional and thorough, and only at the very end did he mention something that should have raised more red flags than it did. "If you hear voices at night," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "just ignore them. The wind does strange things out here, makes sounds that can seem like voices. Previous caretakers have mentioned it. It's nothing to worry about." I probably asked, "What do you mean?" or something equally useless, and he waved it off with a forced laugh about how isolation plays tricks on your mind. Then he was in the helicopter and I was standing in the snow watching him disappear over the mountains, and I was alone in a way I'd never been before. The silence was incredible. Not just the absence of human noise, but the absence of everything. No traffic, no airplanes, no distant machinery, just wind and the occasional raven. The first month was exactly what I needed. I fell into a routine of maintenance work, reading, and long walks around the perimeter with my satellite phone in case of emergencies. I brought probably 40 books, and I was working my way through them systematically. I radioed headquarters every morning at 8 with weather data, and they radioed back confirmation. Sometimes we'd chat for a few minutes about nothing important. Those brief conversations were my only human contact. The voices started in early November, about a week after the first heavy snowfall. I was in the main lab building doing an inventory of the scientific equipment when I heard someone call from outside. A woman's voice, distant but clear, shouting, "Help me. Please, someone help me." I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, but there was no one there. Just undisturbed snow stretching in every direction and my own tracks from earlier in the day. I convinced myself Dr. Webb had been right, that it was just wind or my mind playing tricks. But it happened again that night, and this time it was multiple voices, overlapping and urgent. They seemed to come from the direction of the dormitories, so I bundled up and went out with my flashlight. The voices stopped the moment I stepped outside. The snow around the buildings was smooth and unmarked except for my own footprints from earlier. No one had been there. It became a nightly occurrence. Voices calling for help, shouting warnings I couldn't quite make out, sometimes just sobbing or laughing. Always from outside, always stopping when I went to investigate. I started to dread sunset, knowing the voices would start as soon as it got dark. I mentioned it casually in one of my morning radio calls, and the dispatcher got very quiet before saying, "Dr. Webb said that might happen. Just ignore it. Don't go outside after dark unless it's an emergency." "What do you mean might happen?" I asked. "Has this happened before?" "Previous caretakers reported similar experiences," she said. "It's just a phenomenon of the location. Maybe magnetic fields or something. I don't really understand it, but ignore it and it doesn't escalate." That word, escalate, stuck with me in an unpleasant way. It implied that there was something to escalate from, something beyond just auditory hallucinations. But I didn't push. I think part of me didn't want to know. December brought shorter days and longer nights, and the voices changed. Instead of cries for help, they started saying my name. Always at night, always from just outside the building I was in. Elena, in a dozen different voices. Men, women, children. Sometimes the voice sounded familiar, like someone I'd known, but I could never quite place it. I started sleeping with headphones in, listening to audiobooks at high volume to drown them out. On December 15th, I woke up at 3 in the morning to complete silence. Not just the absence of voices, but the absence of everything. No wind, no creaking of the building, nothing. It was like being in a sensory deprivation chamber. I lay there in my bunk, straining to hear anything, and that's when I heard the footsteps. They were on the roof of the dormitory directly above my room. Slow, heavy footsteps like someone walking back and forth. But the sound was wrong. Not boots or shoes, something softer and heavier at the same time. And there were too many of them. The pattern didn't match human walking. It sounded like something with more than 2 legs pacing above my head. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside in my long underwear and boots, too unnerved to think about proper cold weather gear. I shone the light up at the roof and saw nothing. Fresh snow covered everything in a smooth white blanket. No footprints, no disturbances, no signs that anything had been up there. But as I stood there in the freezing air, I heard it again. Footsteps directly above me, so clear and heavy that snow was shaking loose from the roof edge. I was looking right at where the sound was coming from, and there was nothing there. I spent the rest of the night in the main lab building with all the lights on, wrapped in every blanket I could find. When dawn finally came, I went back to the dormitory and climbed up on a ladder to examine the roof. The snow was undisturbed, but there was a smell up there, faint but unmistakable. Something rotting, something dead. And pressed into the snow near the roof edge, I found a handprint, just one. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own hand, with fingers that were too long and too thin. The print was fresh, crisp, made recently. I radioed headquarters and said I was considering leaving early, citing mental health concerns. The dispatcher transferred me to Dr. Webb, who was suddenly very interested in talking to me. He asked detailed questions about what I'd experienced, and I could hear him typing notes as I answered. When I finished, there was a long pause before he said, "We need you to stay until February. The next scheduled supply drop is January 12th. Can you make it until then?" "What is going on out here?" I asked. "What am I dealing with?" "We don't know," he said, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely troubled. "We've had reports from caretakers going back 15 years. It seems to be localized to that specific area. We've had teams study it, but they can never capture anything definitive. It manifests differently for different people, but no one has ever been physically harmed. The most important thing is not to engage with it. Don't respond to the voices. Don't go outside after dark. Don't," he paused, "don't let it inside." "What is it?" I asked. "If we knew that, we'd have shut down the outpost years ago," he said. "Can you hold out until January?" I said yes because I needed the completion bonus they'd promised, and because part of me was stubborn enough to refuse to be driven away by something I couldn't see. But that night, things escalated. I heard scratching on all the windows of the lab building simultaneously, like multiple people were outside dragging their fingernails across the glass. I heard voices coming from inside the building with me, from rooms I knew were empty. And I heard something heavy being dragged across the roof, back and forth for hours. I didn't sleep. I sat at the main desk with a flare gun in my hand, watching the windows and listening to the sounds that surrounded me. Toward dawn, I heard my ex-husband's voice coming from the radio. The radio was off, but I heard him clearly, saying my name over and over with increasing urgency. "Elena, Elena, Elena, please let me in. It's so cold out here. Please let me in." I unplugged the radio and threw it in a closet, but I could still hear the voice, muffled now, continuing to plead. The sun came up and everything stopped. The scratching, the dragging, the voices, all of it just ceased like someone had flipped a switch. I went outside and found tracks in the snow, dozens of them, circling all 3 main buildings. They were those same wrong handprints, pressed into the snow like something had been crawling. The tracks led from the tree line, circled the buildings multiple times, and then led back to the forest. But here's the thing that made me decide I was leaving. The tracks didn't start or end. They just appeared at the tree line and disappeared back into it, like whatever made them had simply materialized and dematerialized at those points. I packed everything I absolutely needed into a backpack, loaded the snow machine, and left that morning. I didn't wait for authorization or the supply drop or anything else. I just drove south toward the park entrance, following the markers, pushing the machine as fast as I dared. It took 8 hours and I didn't stop once. I made it to the ranger station at the park entrance just after dark. The ranger, a guy named Thomas Cavina, recognized me and said he'd been about to call in a search party. I told him I'd quit and needed a ride to Fairbanks. He didn't push for explanations, just nodded and made some calls. The research outpost was shut down 2 months later, officially due to budget cuts. I got my completion bonus anyway, which made me think Dr. Webb felt guilty about the whole thing. I signed an NDA about my experiences, which was fine with me. I had no interest in talking about it. What bothers me, though, what I still think about years later, is something I found when I unpacked my gear in Fairbanks. In my backpack, wrapped in one of my spare shirts, was a stack of photographs. Old Polaroids, faded and slightly blurry. They showed the research outpost, but from years earlier, judging by the vintage of the photos. In each picture there were figures standing at the edge of the frame. Pale, indistinct figures with wrong proportions, like the camera had caught them mid-step out of focus. On the back of each photo, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was a message. "We're still here. We're always here. Why did you leave?" I never packed those photos. I'd never seen them before. But somehow they ended up in my backpack, wrapped carefully like a gift. I burned them, but sometimes I wonder if that made any difference. Sometimes I wake up and hear my name whispered in voices I don't recognize. And I wonder if whatever was at that outpost decided to follow me home after all. Story 3. The mining town of Resurrection Creek was abandoned in 1987, though I didn't know that when I agreed to go there. I'm Victor Mendez, and back in 2019, I was working for a historical documentation company that specialized in photographing abandoned industrial sites before they were demolished or reclaimed by nature. We'd done factories, hospitals, prisons, that sort of thing. Usually they sent us in pairs, but the Alaska job came up last minute and my usual partner was sick, so they asked if I'd go solo. The pay was double the normal rate. The company had been contracted by the state to document what was left of Resurrection Creek before winter made the site inaccessible. It was maybe a 3-hour drive from Anchorage on roads that got progressively worse, until the last hour was basically just following ruts through the forest. I had coordinates, a detailed map, and enough camping gear to last 5 days. My job was simple: photograph every building, inside and out, collect any historical artifacts that seemed significant, and file a comprehensive report. I arrived on a gray afternoon in late October. The town was smaller than I expected, maybe a dozen buildings scattered along a narrow valley with a half-frozen creek running through it. Most of the structures were collapsed or collapsing. The only buildings still mostly intact were the old processing facility, a 2-story administrative building, and 3 small houses that must have belonged to supervisors or foremen. Everything was weathered silver gray, overgrown with brush, and deeply silent. I set up camp in the administrative building because it still had a roof and most of its windows. The first floor was filled with overturned filing cabinets and scattered paperwork that had rotted into mulch. The second floor was better, with a couple of empty rooms that still had doors that closed. I set up my sleeping bag in the room that seemed driest, stacked my gear, and spent the remaining daylight photographing the exterior of the buildings. There was something about the place that felt heavier than normal abandonment. I'd been in dozens of dead towns and empty facilities, and usually there's just this sense of time having moved on. But Resurrection Creek felt like it was still occupied somehow, like the town was waiting for something to return. I kept getting the sense that I was being watched, and I found myself photographing faster than necessary, wanting to be back inside before dark. That first night was uneventful. I ate a freeze-dried meal, reviewed my photos, and went to sleep around 9. I woke up sometime around midnight to the sound of machinery. Not close, but distant, echoing through the valley. It sounded like the old ore processing equipment was running, those heavy mechanical sounds of conveyor belts and crushers. I lay there listening, trying to figure out if there was some reasonable explanation. Maybe there was another crew working on the site, but no one had mentioned that, and I hadn't seen any other vehicles. The sound ran for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt expectant, like something was waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't do anything. I lay in my sleeping bag, stared at the ceiling, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I walked to the processing facility to photograph it. The building was enormous, probably 60 feet high at its peak, made of corrugated metal and heavy timber framing. The main doors were partially open, rusted on their track. Inside was a cathedral of industrial decay. Massive machines, most stripped of valuable metals over the years, stood silent and skeletal. There were conveyors, hoppers, crushing equipment, all of it seized with rust and strangled with vines that had grown through cracks in the walls. I spent 3 hours in there methodically photographing every section, every detail. It was when I was up on the 3rd-level catwalk, shooting down at the main floor, that I noticed the footprints. They were in the thick dust that covered everything, fresh enough that they hadn't been disturbed by drafts or time. The prints led from the main entrance, wove between machinery, and ended at a section of collapsed flooring. They didn't lead away from that point, just ended. Like whoever made them had walked to that spot and vanished. The prints were wrong. Too narrow, too long, and the stride was irregular. Some steps were normal, others were spaced so far apart that whoever made them must have been taking 6-foot strides. I photographed them carefully, trying to convince myself they were old, and I just couldn't tell because the lighting was strange. But when I climbed down and looked closer, I could see they were recent. Some of the dust they displaced was still settling. I left the processing facility faster than I should have and went back to the administrative building. I spent the rest of the day photographing the houses and the other smaller structures, working with one eye constantly on the tree line. The feeling of being watched had intensified to the point where my shoulders were tight with tension, and I kept spinning around expecting to see someone behind me. The second night, the machinery sound started earlier, around 9 o'clock. This time I got up and went to the window. I could see the processing facility from my second-floor room, and there were lights inside it. Not electric lights, but moving lights, like someone was walking through with a lantern. The machinery sounds were definitely coming from there, the heavy grinding rhythmic noise of equipment that shouldn't be able to run. I grabbed my camera and flashlight and walked across the dark compound toward the facility. I'm not sure why. It seemed important to document whatever was happening, and I think I was still trying to rationalize it as squatters or thieves salvaging equipment. The lights were visible through gaps in the metal siding, and the mechanical sounds were loud enough that I could feel them in my chest. I pushed through the partially open door and the sound stopped. Immediately, completely, like I'd triggered a sensor. The lights vanished. I was standing in total darkness with my flashlight beam cutting through the dust-thick air, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. I swept the light around, and it caught on something that made my breath stop. Standing on the third-level catwalk, exactly where I'd been photographing earlier, was a figure. Tall and thin, too thin, like someone had stretched a person on a rack. It was just standing there, hands hanging past its knees, head tilted at an angle that was too far to be natural. My flashlight beam hit it and it didn't move, didn't react, just stood there like a mannequin. But it wasn't a mannequin. I could see it breathing, or something like breathing. Its chest was moving in this slow, deliberate rhythm. Then it moved. Not toward me, but along the catwalk, and the way it moved made my stomach clench with revulsion. Its joints bent wrong, bent backward and sideways, like its bones weren't connected properly. It moved with this terrible smooth fluidity, like it was floating along the metal walkway, and it was completely silent. No footsteps, no sound at all except for this faint clicking that might have been joints or might have been something else. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I didn't hesitate. I just turned and ran back to the administrative building, slammed the door, and wedged a filing cabinet against it. I could hear myself whimpering as I dragged my sleeping bag into the room furthest from the windows, and I sat there with my back against the wall until sunrise. When light finally came, I forced myself to pack up my gear. I'd completed maybe 60% of my assignment, but I couldn't stay another night. Whatever was in Resurrection Creek, it wasn't just echoes of history or my imagination. I'd seen it. I'd watched it move. I carried my gear down to the first floor and stopped. The filing cabinet I'd wedged against the door was moved. Not toppled, not broken, but moved carefully to the side and positioned upright against the wall, like someone had wanted to open the door without making a mess. And on the floor just inside the entrance, spelled out in what looked like rust flakes or old metal shavings, was a message: "Finish the work." My hands were shaking as I photographed it. Then I grabbed my gear and headed for my truck. The drive out felt like it took forever, and I kept checking the rearview mirror expecting to see that tall, thin figure standing on the road behind me. But I made it back to Anchorage without incident, and I filed my report along with the photos I'd managed to take. My boss was disappointed. I hadn't completed the assignment, but she didn't push when I said the site was unsafe. I didn't mention what I'd seen. The photos I'd taken of the footprints and the message never made it into the official report. I kept them on a separate drive, and sometimes I look at them, trying to understand what I was dealing with. 3 months later, I got an email from someone I didn't know. The subject line was Resurrection Creek Crew Roster, 1987. The email itself was blank except for an attachment. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a scanned document, a handwritten list of names with dates beside them. 23 names total. The dates were all from the same week in March 1987. At the bottom of the document in the same handwriting was a note: "Collapse in Shaft 7, all hands lost, no recovery attempted, site sealed." And below that, in different handwriting, fresher looking, We finished the work. We're still finishing it. Why did you leave? I've never been back to Resurrection Creek, and I've stopped taking solo assignments in abandoned places. But here's what keeps me up at night. 2 weeks after I got that email, I was photographing an abandoned cannery near Kenai. It was a routine job, well-documented history, no weird reputation. I was on the top floor when I heard machinery start up below me. And when I looked down through the gaps in the floor, I saw a tall, thin figure moving between the old processing equipment, its joints bending wrong, moving in that terrible silent glide. It looked up at me, and even though I couldn't see its face clearly in the shadows, I knew it recognized me. Then it was gone, just gone, like it had never been there. But on the floor where it had been standing, spelled out in rust and debris, were 3 words: finish the work. I don't know what work it wants finished. I don't know if it followed me from Resurrection Creek, or if there are multiple things like it scattered across Alaska's abandoned places. But I've stopped taking these jobs. I've stopped photographing empty buildings and forgotten towns, because I think whatever haunts those places doesn't want to be documented. It wants to be left alone to finish whatever work it started decades ago. And I don't want to know what happens when that work is complete. Story 4. My sister disappeared near Lake Iliamna in 2017, and for 2 years everyone said she probably fell through ice or got lost and died of exposure. I'm Sophia Chen, and I didn't accept that explanation because Rachel was smarter than that. She was an experienced wilderness guide who'd spent half her life in the Alaskan backcountry. She knew ice safety, she knew navigation, and she wouldn't have taken stupid risks. What finally made me go looking for answers was a package that arrived at my apartment in Seattle in March 2019. No return address, just my name and address on a priority mailbox. Inside was Rachel's satellite phone, waterlogged and non-functional, and her journal. The journal was water damaged, but parts of it were still legible. I read through it 3 times, and each time my certainty grew that something specific had happened to her, something that had nothing to do with accidents or exposure. The last entry was dated February 12, 2017, 3 days before she was reported missing. It read, "The cabin near Murphy Point is raw. The inside is bigger than the outside should allow. I heard children singing last night, but there are no children for 50 miles. Found teeth in the walls. Small teeth. Going to investigate the back room today. If I don't check in with Sophia by Friday, something happened." That was it. No other details, no explanation of what cabin or why she thought it was wrong. But it was enough for me to start planning a trip. I spent 2 months researching the Murphy Point area, talking to locals and preparing gear. No one wanted to talk much about the area. When I mentioned a cabin near Murphy Point, people got quiet and changed the subject, or said there wasn't any cabin there, which I knew was bullshit because I'd found historical records of a trapper-esque cabin built in the 1960s. I hired a pilot named Chris Erickson who agreed to fly me out to Murphy Point in May 2019. He warned me the weather could change fast, and he might not be able to get back for days if a storm rolled in. I told him that was fine. I brought enough supplies for a week, plus Rachel's coordinates from her GPS unit that had been found with her truck. Murphy Point isn't much of anything. Just a rocky outcropping on the southern shore of Lake Iliamna, where the forest comes down almost to the water. Chris landed on a gravel bar and helped me unload my gear. He said he'd be back in 5 days and would radio me the day before. Then he was gone, and I was alone in country that felt primeval and indifferent. I found the cabin about 2 miles inland from the landing site, following what might have been a trail at some point, but was mostly just a gap in the trees. It was small, maybe 12 by 14 feet, built from weathered logs with a pitched roof covered in moss. It looked abandoned but not as old as it should have been. The logs were in good condition and the door hung straight on its hinges. What Rachel had written was true. Standing outside the cabin, I could see it was maybe 12 feet on each side. But when I opened the door and looked inside, the interior space seemed larger. Not impossibly larger, not like it was the size of a warehouse. Just wrong. The proportions didn't match. It should have been a single room, but I could see a doorway at the back leading to another room that shouldn't fit. The main room was empty except for a camp stove and some scattered debris. The walls were bare logs, nothing unusual. I set down my pack and pulled out my flashlight, even though it was bright afternoon and there was light coming through the 2 windows. The flashlight beam seemed dimmer inside the cabin, like the air itself was thick and absorbing the light. I walked to the back doorway and looked through. The room beyond was smaller, maybe 8 by 8, and completely empty. The walls were different though. The logs weren't smooth and weathered like the outer room. They were scratched and gouged like animals or people had been clawing at them, and pressed into the wood, small and white, were teeth. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All different sizes, from baby teeth to molars, pressed into the logs like decorations. I think I said something out loud. What the fuck, maybe, or just a sound of revulsion. I backed out of the doorway and stood in the main room, trying to steady my breathing. This was what Rachel had found. This was what she meant by wrong. I should have left then. I should have walked back to the landing site, radioed Chris, and gotten the hell out. But I needed to understand what had happened to Rachel, and this cabin was the last place she'd been. So I set up my tent outside, about 30 yards from the cabin, and spent the daylight hours photographing and documenting everything I could. The teeth in the walls bothered me more than anything. They weren't just pressed in randomly. There was a pattern to them, a spiral that started at the door and wound around the room. I got close enough to examine them and confirmed they were real. Human teeth, I thought, though some were small enough they might have been from children. I tried not to think about how many people it would take to collect that many teeth. That night, I heard the singing. It started around midnight, thin and distant like children's voices carried on wind. They were singing something that sounded like a nursery rhyme, but I couldn't make out the words. The melody was wrong somehow, notes that didn't quite fit together. It made my skin crawl, but I stayed in my tent with my knife in my hand and listened. The singing stopped around 3 in the morning and was replaced by scratching sounds. They came from inside the cabin, rhythmic and persistent. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. It went on for an hour and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a porcupine or a squirrel. But it was too regular, too measured. When dawn came, I packed up my tent and most of my gear. I decided I was leaving, calling Chris early and getting out of there. But before I did, I needed to check the cabin one more time. I needed to see if anything had changed. The main room looked the same, but the back room was different. The spiral of teeth in the walls had changed. There were more of them, and they'd been rearranged into a different pattern. And written on the back wall in what looked like charcoal or dark ash were words, "They want to sing with you." My hands were shaking as I photographed it. Then I heard a sound from above. Footsteps on the roof, light and fast like children running, but not quite children. The rhythm was wrong, too many steps, too quick. And then I heard giggling, high-pitched and wrong like it was being played backwards. I ran. I grabbed my pack from outside and started walking as fast as I could back toward the landing site. I could hear them following me, moving through the trees parallel to my path. I never saw them clearly, just flashes of pale skin and jerky movement between the trunks. The giggling continued, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, always just out of sight. I was maybe halfway back to the landing site when I stumbled over something in the trail. I caught myself and looked back at what I'd tripped on. It was a boot. Rachel's boot. I recognized the brand and the wear pattern. Just the boot, sitting in the middle of the trail. Nothing else. No other gear, no sign of a struggle, just a single boot positioned like someone had carefully placed it there. I picked it up and kept moving. The giggling had stopped, but I could still hear movement in the trees. When I reached the landing site, the gravel bar was empty. Chris wasn't due for 4 more days. I set up my tent, built a fire, and sat with my back to the lake, watching the tree line. They didn't come out of the forest, not while I was watching. But every time I looked away, when I'd glance at the lake or stoke the fire, I'd see something shift in the trees. A pale figure darting between shadows. A face pressed against bark, watching me with empty eyes. Small faces, child-sized but not children. The proportions were wrong. I stayed awake for 3 days, only dozing in short 20-minute increments. I burned through most of my fuel, keeping the fire going day and night. When Chris finally landed on the gravel bar, I was packed and standing at the water's edge. He took one look at me and didn't ask questions, just loaded my gear and took off. On the flight back, I looked out the window at the forest below and saw them. Pale figures standing in clearings, dozens of them, all looking up at the plane as we passed overhead. Chris didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was just used to seeing strange things in the backcountry. I never found out what happened to Rachel. The journal and the phone weren't enough evidence for the police to reopen the investigation, and I didn't mention what I'd seen because I knew how it would sound. But I kept Rachel's boot, and sometimes I look at it and wonder what she found in that back room of the cabin. What she saw that made her disappear so completely. 3 weeks after I got back to Seattle, I found small handprints on my apartment windows. On the inside, I live on the 14th floor, and sometimes late at night, I hear that singing. Thin and distant, like children's voices carried on wind, singing a nursery rhyme with notes that don't quite fit together. I've stopped sleeping with the windows open. I've stopped sleeping much at all, because I think whatever was in that cabin, whatever happened to Rachel, it's not done with my family yet. Story 5. I got stuck in Coldfoot for 3 days in January 2020 because of a whiteout that shut down the Dalton Highway in both directions. My name's Michael Hartley. I was driving north to Deadhorse for a pipeline inspection job, and I'd made the mistake of trying to push through weather that was rapidly deteriorating. By the time I realized I needed to stop, Coldfoot was the only option within range. Coldfoot is barely a town. It's got a truck stop, a small hotel, and a handful of buildings that service the truckers and workers traveling the Dalton. In summer, it's busy enough. In January, during a whiteout, it was me, 2 other stranded drivers, and a skeleton staff that ran the hotel and diner. The hotel clerk, a woman named Isabella Santos, checked me in and mentioned they were short-staffed because most of the winter crew had quit unexpectedly. When I asked why, she just shrugged and said something about the isolation being harder on some people than others. My room was small and overheated, with a window that looked out at the parking lot and the mountains beyond. The blowing snow was so thick I could barely see 20 feet, just white chaos and the occasional dark shape of a parked truck. I settled in, figuring I'd catch up on sleep and wait out the storm. The first night was fine. I ate dinner in the diner, exchanged nods with the other stranded drivers, and went to bed around 9. I woke up around 2 in the morning because the heater had shut off and the room was freezing. I could see my breath. I called the front desk, but no one answered. I threw on clothes and went down to the lobby to complain. The lobby was empty and dark except for the light behind the front desk. Isabella wasn't there. I rang the bell a few times, waited, and finally went back to my room. The heater had kicked back on by the time I got there, and the room was warming up. I chalked it up to the storm causing power fluctuations and went back to sleep. The second night, I heard someone walking in the hallway outside my room, back and forth, slow and deliberate footsteps on the carpet. It went on for maybe 20 minutes. I looked through the peephole but couldn't see anyone. The hallway was empty and lit by those dim emergency lights they keep on at night, but I could still hear the footsteps, clear as anything, right outside my door. I opened the door quickly, thinking I'd catch whoever was out there. The hallway was empty. But the footsteps didn't stop. I could still hear them, now coming from further down the hall, fading toward the stairwell. I followed the sound, but when I reached the stairwell, it was silent and empty. The whole thing gave me an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite shake. The next morning at breakfast, I mentioned it to the other drivers. One of them, an older guy named Pete Navarro, gave me a long look and said, "You hear walking, you don't follow it. That's the rule here." When I asked what he meant, he shook his head and went back to his food. Isabella, who was serving coffee, didn't say anything, but I caught her exchanging a glance with Pete that confirmed whatever was going on. It wasn't just my imagination. The storm was supposed to break that afternoon, but instead it got worse. Visibility dropped to nothing, and the temperature fell to -30. The power started flickering, and Isabella announced they were shutting down the diner early to conserve fuel. We were all confined to the hotel, and the atmosphere had shifted from inconvenient to oppressive. That afternoon, I was in my room reading when I heard a knock at my door. 3 sharp raps. I looked through the peephole and saw a kid standing there. Maybe 10 or 11 years old, wearing old-fashioned clothes. A wool coat and cap like something from the 1950s. He was just standing there, not moving, looking straight at the peephole. I opened the door. "You lost, kid." The hallway was empty. No one there, but I'd been looking through the peephole 2 seconds earlier and the kid had been standing right there. I stepped into the hallway and looked both directions. Nothing. The nearest room doors were all closed. I went downstairs and found Isabella in the lobby. "Is there a kid staying here?" I asked. 10, 11 years old. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me carefully. "No children," she said. "Just you and the other 2 drivers." "I just saw a kid outside my room," I said. Isabella's expression went carefully neutral. "What did he look like?" I described the old-fashioned clothes and she nodded slowly. "Room 9, she said. "You're in room 9. When I confirmed, she rubbed her face like she was very tired. "That room has issues. I can move you." "What kind of issues?" "People see things, hear things. I should have mentioned it, but we were so short on rooms." She pulled out a key. "Room 14 is empty. Move your stuff, and don't go back to room 9 except to get your things." I should have asked more questions, but something about her tone made me just take the key and nod. I went back upstairs, packed my stuff quickly, and moved to room 14. The new room felt different. Warmer, quieter, less oppressive. I didn't realize how tense I'd been in room 9 until I was out of it. That night I couldn't sleep. The storm was howling, the building was creaking, and I kept thinking about that kid in the hallway. Around midnight I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were right outside room 14. Back and forth, slow and measured. I looked through the peephole and saw the kid again. Still wearing those old clothes, still looking straight at the door like he could see me through the peephole. Then he knocked. 3 sharp raps. I didn't open the door. Something about the way he stood, completely still except for his arm reaching up to knock, felt deeply wrong. I watched through the peephole as he knocked again. 3 raps, then again. The knocking continued, regular and mechanical for what felt like hours. I backed away from the door and sat on the bed, listening to that repetitive sound. The knocking stopped suddenly and I heard a voice from right outside the door. A child's voice, muffled and somehow flat. "Let me in. It's cold out here. Please let me in." I didn't respond. The voice continued, the same 3 sentences repeated in the exact same inflection. "Let me in. It's cold out here. Please let me in." Over and over like a recording. I grabbed my satellite phone and called the front desk. Isabella answered after 6 rings. "Are you hearing this?" I asked. "There's a kid outside my door." "Do not open the door," she said, suddenly urgent. "Whatever you do, do not let it inside." "What is it?" "I don't know," she said. "It's been here for years, since before I started working here. It shows up during whiteouts, mostly in January. It knocks, it talks, it tries to get you to open the door. Don't do it. What happens if you do? There was a long pause. The previous manager opened his door. They found him the next morning. She paused again. He looked like he'd been out in the cold for days. Frostbite, hypothermia, even though he was inside with the heater running. But the worst part was his face. He looked terrified, like he'd seen something that broke him. I sat there listening to the voice outside my door, now saying, "I know you're in there. Why won't you help me? It's so cold." The voice had changed slightly, now carrying a tone of hurt and accusation that made me feel genuinely guilty for not opening the door. "It uses emotions," Isabella said, like she was reading my thoughts. "It makes you feel bad for not helping, but it's not a child. It's not anything that needs help. Just wait it out. It'll stop before dawn." She was right. Around 4 in the morning, the voice stopped. The hallway went silent except for the storm. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep at all that night. The storm broke the next morning and the highway was cleared by noon. I checked out immediately and Isabella didn't charge me for the third night. "I'm sorry," she said. "We should close room 9, but management won't approve it. They say we need every room for winter." "What is it?" I asked again. "What's doing this?" "A family died here in 1962, she said quietly. "The old Coldfoot station before this building was built. A couple and their son got caught in a storm while traveling to Fairbanks. They tried to wait it out in a mining shack that used to stand where the hotel is now. They froze to death. All 3 of them. People have seen the kid ever since, always wearing those same clothes. Always knocking, always trying to get in from the cold. But why does it hurt people who let it in?" "I think because it's angry," she said. "It's been out in the cold for 60 years and it's angry at everyone who has warmth when it doesn't. Or maybe it just doesn't understand it's dead and it brings the cold with it wherever it goes." She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. I just know not to open the door." I drove out that afternoon, but the memory of that voice stayed with me. The weird mix of childish pleading and something else underneath, something cold and hollow. I've driven the Dalton Highway dozens of times since, but I've never stopped in Coldfoot again. I find other places to wait out storms, even if it means hours of extra driving. But here's the thing that keeps me up sometimes. About a month after that trip, I was at a truck stop near Fairbanks. It was late, around 2 in the morning, and I was the only person in the parking lot. I was in my truck, catching a few hours of sleep when I heard knocking on the door, 3 sharp raps. Through the windshield I could see a figure standing in the parking lot lights, a kid in old-fashioned clothes looking at my truck. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. But as I pulled onto the highway, I checked my rearview mirror and saw him standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. I was 50 miles from Coldfoot. There's no way the same kid could be there. But it looked exactly the same. Same clothes, same posture, same stillness. I don't think it's confined to Coldfoot anymore. Or maybe it never was. Maybe it just finds places where it's cold enough, where the storms are bad enough, and it goes there looking for warmth it can't ever really feel. I've heard the knocking twice more since then, always during winter, always in isolated places. I never stop to check. I just drive until I'm somewhere with people and lights and noise. Because I think that kid isn't alone anymore. I think he's found others like him, other people who froze and couldn't let go. And they're all looking for warmth, all knocking on doors, all waiting for someone to be stupid enough to let them in. Story 6. The hunting cabin at Willow Creek Pass was supposed to be empty when I arrived in November 2021. My buddy, a guy named Jackson Price, had inherited it from his grandfather and had been talking about fixing it up for years. He'd finally gotten around to organizing a work party, and I'd volunteered to go up early and assess what needed to be done. Jackson was supposed to meet me there 2 days later with supplies and more help. I'm Alana Reeves, and at the time I was 29 and working construction in Anchorage. I'd done cabin rehab before, so Jackson trusted me to get a head start. The cabin was about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible by ATV trail in summer and snow machine in winter. November was that awkward transition period where the trail was muddy and partially frozen, making the trip take twice as long as it should have. I arrived late afternoon on a gray day that threatened snow. The cabin was larger than I expected, 2 rooms and a loft, built from massive logs that must have been held to transport. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense birch and spruce, with mountains visible through gaps in the trees. The place looked weathered but solid, and I was already mentally cataloging what we'd need to replace or repair. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open and stepped into musty darkness that smelled like old wood smoke and animal musk. I propped the door open to let light in and did a quick walkthrough. The main room had a wood stove, a table, and 2 chairs. The back room was smaller, with bunk beds built into the wall. The loft was accessed by a ladder and was empty except for dust and cobwebs. Everything looked stable, just old and neglected. I spent the first hour unloading my gear and sweeping out the worst of the dirt and debris. There were mouse droppings everywhere, and something had nested in the wood stove at some point. The windows were intact but filthy, filtering light into dim brown-tinted illumination. I propped open the back room door to air it out, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Something dead, somewhere close. I checked the obvious places under the bunks and the corners behind the stove but couldn't locate the source. The smell was just there, persistent and unpleasant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I opened more windows despite the cold and decided to deal with it later. That night, I set up my sleeping bag in the main room near the stove and got a fire going. The cabin warmed up quickly and the smell faded to something I could ignore. I made dinner on my camp stove, read for a while by headlamp, and went to sleep around 10. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet, like the forest outside was holding its breath. I woke up around midnight because something was moving in the back room. Not big movement, just shuffling sounds like someone was dragging their feet across the floor. I lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was mice or branches scraping the roof. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate. Shuffle, 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 pause, shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. I called out, "Hello." My voice sounded thin and unconvincing. The shuffling stopped. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then got out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my flashlight. The back room door was closed. I didn't remember closing it, but I'd been tired when I went to sleep. Maybe I had. I opened the door and shone my light inside. The bunks were empty. The floor was clear. But the smell was stronger in there, that dead, rotting smell, and now there was something else mixed with it. Something chemical, like bleach or formaldehyde. I backed out and closed the door, wedging one of the chairs under the handle for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. The shuffling started again around 3 in the morning, but this time it was in the loft. I could hear it directly above my head, that same slow, dragging movement. Back and forth across the loft floor. I didn't investigate. I just lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to that sound until dawn. When light finally came, I climbed up to check the loft. It was empty except for dust. But there were marks in the dust, long drag marks like something had been pulled back and forth across the floor. The marks were fresh, made recently. I climbed down, made coffee, and seriously considered hiking back out and telling Jackson the cabin wasn't worth saving. But I didn't. I'm not sure why. Stubbornness, maybe, or not wanting to admit I'd been spooked by what was probably just animals and old building sounds. I spent the day working outside, replacing rotted boards on the porch and checking the foundation. I avoided going inside except to get tools or take a break. Late afternoon, I was carrying lumber from the woodpile when I saw someone standing at the tree line. A woman, I thought at first, wearing what looked like a long dress or coat. She was just standing there, maybe 50 yards away, not moving. I waved and she didn't respond. I started walking toward her, intending to ask if she was lost or needed help. The closer I got, the more wrong she looked. The coat wasn't a coat, it was just a pale covering like fabric or paper wrapped around her. And she wasn't standing normally. She was too upright, too stiff, like she was hanging from something invisible. I stopped about 30 yards away, and that's when I realized she didn't have a face. Just smooth, blank skin where her features should be. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off her. She didn't follow, didn't move at all, just stood there like a sentinel. When I reached the porch, I risked a glance away to climb the steps, and when I looked back, she was gone. Just gone, like she'd been a trick of the fading light. But the trees where she'd stood were still swaying slightly, like something had just moved through them. I went inside and barricaded the door with the table. The sun was setting, and I knew with complete certainty that I didn't want to spend another night in that cabin. But hiking out in the dark was just as dangerous, maybe more so. I was trapped by my own stupid decisions, stuck in a place that was growing more hostile with each passing hour. The shuffling started earlier that night, around 8 o'clock. It was in the back room again, but louder now, more aggressive. Something was being dragged across the floor repeatedly, and mixed with the dragging sound was something else. A wet sound, like something soft being moved. I sat with my back to the stove, knife in hand, listening to whatever was in that room work itself into a rhythm. Then the door started to open. I'd wedged a chair under the handle, but the door was pushing against it, slowly and steadily. The chair scraped across the floor inch by inch, and I could see the gap widening, darkness beyond gradually revealing itself. I grabbed my pack and flashlight and went out the front door. I didn't care about the dark or the cold or the dangerous trail. I just needed to be away from whatever was in that cabin. I hiked through the dark for maybe an hour, using my headlamp and moving as fast as I dared until I reached a small hollow where I felt secure enough to stop. I made a cold camp, no fire, and sat with my back against a rock, watching the trail behind me. I heard them around midnight. Voices, multiple voices, coming from the direction of the cabin. They sounded like people calling to each other, organizing a search. "Alana, where are you? We need to find her." The voices sounded concerned, helpful, but they were all wrong. Too flat, too similar, like the same person trying to imitate multiple voices. The voices got closer, and I pressed myself against the rock, trying to be as small and silent as possible. Flashlight beams swept through the trees, but they didn't move like real flashlights. They were too steady, too uniform, like the beams weren't affected by whoever was carrying them. And the voices kept calling my name, now with an edge of frustration. "Alana, this isn't funny. Come back to the cabin. It's dangerous out here." They passed within 20 yards of my position, and I saw them through the trees. 4 figures, all wearing those same pale coverings, all moving in that too stiff way. Their flashlight beams came from nowhere I could see, just emanated from them like they were generating their own light. They moved up the trail away from me, their voices fading, still calling my name. I stayed in that hollow until dawn, frozen and exhausted but alive. When the sun rose, I hiked out as fast as I could. I made it back to my truck around noon and drove straight to Jackson's place in Anchorage. I told him the cabin was a loss, structurally unsound and not worth salvaging. He was disappointed but accepted it. I never told him what I'd actually seen. 3 weeks later, Jackson called me. He'd gone up to the cabin himself to see how bad it really was. He'd found it in perfect condition, everything solid and well-maintained. He wanted to know why I'd lied to him. I didn't have a good answer. I just said I'd made a mistake in my assessment and left it at that. Our friendship didn't survive that lie, and I regret losing him as a friend. But I don't regret lying. Because what I found when I developed the photos from my trip made me certain I'd made the right choice. I'd taken pictures of the cabin exterior on that first day, just documentation shots. In two of them, if you look carefully at the windows, you can see faces. Multiple faces pressed against the glass from inside looking out. Pale faces with no features, just smooth blank skin. The photos are dated November 3rd, hours before I saw anything strange. Whatever was in that cabin wasn't reacting to my presence. It was already there, waiting. Jackson sold the cabin 6 months later to an out-of-state buyer who wanted a remote hunting property. I think about warning them sometimes, but what would I even say? Instead, I just check the Anchorage news every few months, looking for stories about missing hunters or unexplained deaths near Willow Creek Pass. So far, there's been nothing. Maybe the new owners are lucky. Maybe whatever lives in that cabin is satisfied with just watching. Or maybe it's patient, waiting for the right moment, the right person who will open the wrong door at the wrong time. I hope I'm wrong. But I remember those faces in the windows, and I don't think I am. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.